It's probably me. I actually kicked it a couple.
It's okay.
I'll reach my legs out. I'm like, oh, I just tapped that.
Wow. This is really sparse.
Did everyone save their rainy days for today?
I guess. You know what? Y'all are going to get a little extra credit for showing up.
Woo!
I know it's the end of the semester, but that's usually when everybody like rallies and tries to, I haven't been here all semester, I'll show up for 2 days and I'll pass. Usually doesn't work that way. But wow. Okay, so we're going to try to get through this so that you made it. All right, so we're going to try to get through this so we don't have to come on Friday because I don't want to. This is my actual busy time at my real job because we have that Christmas event this weekend, and I would really rather not be here on Friday. Okay, so we've elected Pierce. We figured out he was not the greatest president. We're trading with Pan, which is kind of irrelevant to why we start the Civil War, but it was something that happened during that time period. And then another monkey wrench gets thrown into the works. Can't remember the guy's first name. Stephen Douglas brought forth a proposal to Congress. Now, one of the big moving factors during this time, yes, slavery seems to be the center of the conversation, at least the conversation we're having. And it was the center of the conversation for a whole lot of people in the country in the 1840s and 50s. But it was not the only conversation. There was a lot of talk of building a transcontinental railroad, tying the country together, tying California to the rest of the nation by rail. Railroad building, we talked about that, has been booming. There's a lot of industrial growth. And so there's a lot of talk of a railroad, a transcontinental railroad. And there's several routes proposed. There's a northern route that's going to run from Milwaukee to the Columbia River in Oregon. A central route that would go from St. Louis to San Francisco. And then another central route that would go from Memphis to Los Angeles. And a southern route that would run from Houston to Los Angeles through the Gadsden Purchase, which is that little bitty area at the bottom that we didn't get from Mexico during the war, but we go back and buy it. And that was actually one of the better routes in a lot of ways. It had the advantage of weather. It had the advantage of not crossing the Rocky Mountains. And it was pushed by Jefferson Davis, who was the Secretary of War at the time. I don't remember if he's Secretary of War, Secretary of War. We bought the Gadsden Purchase for, that's not right, in 1850. We bought it in 1853. Stephen F. Douglas was promoting one of the middle routes. He wanted the Chicago to be the eastern terminus, and he offered up a bill to form a new territory of Nebraska. So, come here now. Nebraska, it's right here in the middle. This is what he's proposing, that we make this into a new territory. Kansas is part of that. Now, if you remember, we have this. We've had the Missouri Compromise, and we have the other compromise, the Compromise of 1850, that is holding things steady on slavery. Slavery is not supposed to be permitted above this line in the territories, except for Missouri. That was a Missouri Compromise. Slavery would be allowed in Missouri, but nothing else above this line. So they're up. Douglas proposes a bill that is going to include all the unorganized parts of the Louisiana Purchase from up to the Canadian border. So basically from the Indian Territory up. All of this. He needs Southern support, so he puts in the plan a proposal that will basically negate the Missouri Compromise. He said, we'll allow popular sovereignty to rule these new territories. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the people in that territory, in that state, will decide whether or not they want slavery. So part of his proposal is to amend the Missouri Compromise, because obviously you can't have two rules. And no one's really sure what his motives were. I think he was just so focused on getting that transcontinental railroad that he misread the situation. Because this immediately sparks the tensions again. Southerners are all for it. This is the way we're going to bring slaves into the territories. Abolitionists hate it. This is going to be a way Southerners are going to bring slaves into the territories. We don't want it to spread. It's going to completely destroy the Whigs as a party. It's going to fragment the Democrats, even though they will hold together. And it's going to spark a territorial war. Douglas completely failed to appreciate the strength. Not just, I have an anti-slavery feelings, but also a pro-slavery feelings. Both sides have really dug in at this point. And there are a lot of, I think Douglas thought that the abolitionists wouldn't be that virulent. but they were. So with the end of the Whig Party, you're going to, and this note's not up there, so just listen. You get the emergence of the Republican Party. In 1854, what was left of the Whigs joined with some independent Democrats and some Free Soilers to form the Republican Party. So you're going to have Democrats, Republicans, and a couple of third-party types. But this sectional war that is kicked off is kind of a preview of the Civil War. And it gets ugly really fast. Most everybody agreed that Nebraska would come in as a free state. Most of the settlers there were from free states. They were Northerners or Midwesterners or New Englanders. Not a lot of slave owners, there were a few. But Kansas is still a question. So if Kansas comes in, the Southerners, the Southerners see in Kansas a chance. And so the idea of popular sovereignty is the people in that territory will decide. So now the race is to get as many of your people in that territory to vote as possible. And both camps start lining people up. And there's a rush on Kansas. Not all of them were going to stay, but there's a rush to get there. In 1854, the first governor arrived. There were already several thousand settlers. He orders a census and arranges for elections to be held in 1855. Well, the pro-slavery forces sweep those polls. A lot of the pro-slavery voters actually came from Missouri, just crossed the border and voted. There was a lot of intimidation. There was a lot of fraud on both sides. But the pro-slavery forces sweep the polls and they set up, they start to set up the government. But in 1855, Free State advocates also claimed victory, and they set up a government in Topeka. They wrote a constitution. I'm not saying they're any better than the pro-slavery forces because their constitution bans all blacks from the state entirely. So racism is not gone. And the battle lines are starting to be drawn. In May of 1856, a pro-slavery mob took Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas was a free state hotbed. They destroyed, it was also where the governor's house, the free state governor lived there. So we have we will have two governors at different points. So they destroy the newspapers, they set fire to the governor's house, they steal property, they demolish the Free State Hotel. Probably a bad choice for a name, just because it makes you a target. But there was only one fatality. But there was a fatality. And this awoke in a man some passion. And this man was John Brown. Personally, I think John Brown was a psychopath. But, history has differing opinions of him. At the very least, he was a fanatic. He was an abolitionist. He was a free state man. And he saw in this Lawrence raid a cause. And so he takes a couple of his sons and some other free state men, and they raid Potawatomi, Kansas, in what has become the Potawatomi, okay, I'll get it right, massacre. And this happens in 1856, later in May. He didn't wait very long. And they escalate the violence horrifically. They go to this town, they drag 5 men from their homes, and they hack them to death with swords in front of their families. Don't know if these men even had a role in going to Lawrence, Kansas. So the other side has to retaliate. You kill our guys, we're going to kill yours. I really, really dislike all of these Indian names that they pick for all of these towns. So the next town is Osawatomie, Kansas. It's looted, burned, and one of John Brown's sons is shot. That's the town that he lived in. And it's going to go back and forth like this through all of 1856. By the end of the year, over 200 people are going to be killed, about 2 million destroyed in property, and people are looking at this violence and either being repulsed and driven to one side or repulsed and driven to the other side. But people are really starting to take sides. And John Brown's not done yet. They don't kill him, they just kill one of his sons. And he vows that before this is all over, he will end slavery. The violence that is in Kansas also spills over to other parts of the country. It is particularly noted in the Senate. Our government is supposed to be dignified. They're supposed to act as ladies and gentlemen, or at this time just gentlemen because there weren't any ladies involved. But on May 22nd, 1856, all of that breaks. 2 days earlier, a man named Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered an inflammatory speech, a very long inflammatory speech. It goes on for 2 days, called The Crime Against Kansas. And in this speech, he singles out South Carolina's Andrew Pickens Butler, who was an elderly statesman. Basically, I should have marked the quote. He says that he has slept with his mistress and his mistress is slavery. And it's a personal insult. Well, Mr. Butler is an elderly gentleman, and he is not going to seek revenge for this. But remember how we talked about Southerners and this idea of honor and honor above everything else? Well, he had a cousin in Congress, Preston Brooks. He's a South Carolina congressman. He knew that Sumner would refuse a duel. Dueling is illegal technically, but Southerners still relied on that to avenge people's honor. But ever since the Aaron Burr incident, dueling has lost its, has kind of faded in fashion among the well-born outside of the South. So Brooks knew he couldn't get revenge in a duel. So he just brings a cane to the Senate House and beats the man almost to death on the floor of the Senate. This shocks the entire nation. It doesn't do a whole lot for the Southern cause either. It just makes Southerners look more violent. And it creates a martyr. For the next 2 or 3 years, Brooks does not return, Sumner does not return to the Senate. But his desk stays there, empty, as a reminder. So all Brooks does is create a martyr. But the sectional politics are starting to pull everything apart. And we have another election coming up, the election of 1856. Finally, parties are actually forced to take a stand to a point on slavery. The Southerners are going to put forth Millard Fillmore as their candidate. The Republicans with this new party are going to use John Fremont, and they're going to steal the free soil because a lot of free soilers joined in the Republican Party. They had free soil, free speech, free men, and there was free something else. Now they changed it to free soil, free speech, and Fremont. The Republicans actually have a platform that favors the Transcontinental Railroad, government-financed internal improvements. It condemns the repeal of the Missouri Compromise and the Democratic policy of territorial expansion. It also condemns polygamy and slavery. So slavery actually makes it into a platform. So does polygamy. The Democrats are going to turn on Pierce because he just really wasn't that great a president. He's one of the few that does not win his party's. Usually the president, if you're president, you're going to be first up if it's your first term. For a second term, not for Pierce. Pierce was out, and not by his own choosing. So they choose James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. They endorse the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They call for enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law, stress that Congress should stay out of slavery in the territories or states. Those three are designed to get Southern support. To get Northern support, they condemn nativism and endorse religious liberty. Those two moves were designed to get the Irish and the German votes. Racism doesn't just extend to the African Americans. The Irish, the Chinese, the Germans were all also suffering from that. And this was a bid to get their support, sorry. The Republicans are basically a Northern party. Buchanan is really the only true national candidate. And Buchanan will win. Now, Buchanan was a politician. His career went back to 1815 as a Pennsylvania legislature. He'd served in Congress for over 20 years. He'd been ambassador to Russia and Britain. He'd been Pope, Secretary of State. He was known as a states' rights man. And he was a unionist, but he was willing to concede to the South on some things. And so the South had some hope in Buchanan. His first move is you name your cabinet. Well, he named 4 slave state men and 3 free state men, which the Southerners also took as a sign that Buchanan would be on their side. Unfortunately, Buchanan just never really took a stand. He never really took a stand on anything. And there's 3 things that will kind of undo him as president. The first is the Dred Scott decision. The actual ruling was in March 6, 1857. I'll jump to the end and spoil it, but then I'm going to go back and talk about it. The Supreme Court ruled that Scott was a slave, had no legal standing, and was not a citizen. And therefore could not win his freedom in the courts. But Taney, who is the Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, writes the majority opinion, and he adds in there some statements that basically negate the Missouri Compromise about a citizen being able to take their property to other states, kind of supporting that Southern idea, that Calhoun idea of the Fifth Amendment, that no state could actually outlaw slavery. Taney didn't need to do that. He could have stopped with saying, Dred Scott is not a citizen, therefore we can't rule on his case. But he throws that in. So the case, let's go and talk about it for a second. Dred Scott was born as a slave around 1800. People didn't keep good records. He had been taken to St. Louis in 1830 by his owner, who was an army surgeon. Then he was taken to Illinois, to the Wisconsin Territory, and then back to St. Louis. While in Wisconsin, Scott had married a woman named Harriet Robinson, had 2 daughters. The surgeon died in 1842. And Scott attempted to buy his freedom from the man's wife, who had inherited him, to no avail. She was not interested in selling him, even to himself. And in 1846, Harriet convinced Dred that he needed to file for freedom based on his residency in Illinois and Wisconsin, which had both outlawed slavery. The jury in the state, the first court, ruled in his favor. The wife appealed, and the state Supreme Court ruled against him. So then it gets appealed to the Supreme Court. And while, sounds callous, but while the effect on Dred Scott, I'm sorry, you're still a slave, is not nationally significant, the fact that Taney basically negated the Missouri Compromise was very significant. And the ruling that just because you take a slave into a free state doesn't free him was very important nationally. And while Buchanan was president, he really couldn't do anything about this. It doesn't help his standing. The next thing that Buchanan does goes back to that Nebraska-Kansas thing. And what was called the Lecompton Convention, Lecompton Constitution, sorry. That came out of the Lecompton Convention, held in Lecompton, Kansas. So just before Buchanan took office, the pro-slavery forces in Kansas had called for a constitutional convention. The governor vetoed the measure. Since there was no provision made for a referendum, the legislature overrode it. So at this point in Kansas, you have a free state governor, a pro-slavery legislation. The governor said, screw you, I'm out of here, resigns. and is replaced by a man named Robert Walker. He is put there by Buchanan. Walker was a Unionist and called for fair elections, but it was too late to convince the Free State people in Kansas that a fair election could even be held, so most of them didn't even vote, which of course meant that the pro-slavery people won. If you don't go out and vote, you can't win at all. But they figured they weren't going to win anyway, that it was rigged. So now you have a pro-slavery constitution being put before the people. Now, one thing that Walker did manage to do was get the Free State people to vote in territorial elections. They didn't vote for the Constitution, but they voted in the territorial elections. The territorial elections elect the legislature, and they won handily. So now you have a pro-slavery constitution being put in front of the people and a Free State legislature. Well, Buchanan throws his weight behind the pro-slavery people. Walker also resigns. Clearly, it was a Free State territory. The majority of the people were clearly Free State. There were only 200 slaves in the entire state in 1860. There's not, that's not a massive number. And they have a pro-slavery constitution that passes in Congress, but it doesn't even pass in its own state. So it passes in Congress, it's supposed to be voted on again in Kansas, and it doesn't pass. But Buchanan failed in that area. And then the last thing that was his undoing was a panic. People will deal with a lot when economic times are good, but when the economy starts to crash, people have a lot less patience. And it starts to crash in August of 1857. There's a rapid reduction in demand for foreign demand for American grain. Overly rapid railroad construction has caused some inflation. Overproduction in manufacturing has left businesses with there's too much supply for the demand. They have overproduced. And foreigners aren't buying it because they can buy their own goods cheaper, and we have tariffs that are keeping things high. And then the last thing is there's more funny business with state banks. The Northerners are going to blame the tariff. The Southerners are actually going to weather this crisis better because cotton doesn't crash. Grain crashes, but cotton is still in demand. And it leads Southern planters to this false idea that cotton is king. And that cotton will always be king. Cotton is king until the British don't want it anymore. But they don't see that yet. And it's going to come back to bite them in the butt. And I said high tariffs, it's low tariffs. So Buchanan isn't doing well. I apparently skipped a slide when I made my slides. There's also a religious revival at this time, and no, it doesn't have anything to do with what's up there. But you're going to have throughout, so the panic is going to last 1857 through 1859. You're going to have a revival movement at the same time, but it's not going to be the same as the Great Awakening. This is a more personal type movement, and it's actually a more urban movement. It started by a man named Jeremiah Linfier, who started leading prayer meetings outside of Wall Street offices so that financiers could find God. And during this time, over 500,000 people are going to join churches. And it focuses on personal prayer. They would just have big prayer meetings. And they're not praying for the end of slavery. They're not praying for women's rights. They're not praying for these big social movements. They're praying for themselves. They're praying for their own salvation. I'm not, and that sounds selfish, but it's not. This isn't going to be a religious movement that's going to lead to great revivals. This is a religious movement that brings people peace, personally peace. And I just want to mention it because I think it's very interesting that this happens during this time. Politically, while Buchanan is floundering in office, some other things are going on. People are seeing that Buchanan's floundering, and so people are starting to line up for the next presidential election. But there's Senate elections first, and in Illinois, there's a run for the Senate seat that becomes very nationally important. Stephen Douglas is going to run. He is holding the Senate seat at this point. He seems like the Democrats' best hope as the next presidential candidate, but he's not unaffected by controversies. I mean, he was the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But that's good and bad. The Northerners like the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Southerners like that he opposed Lecompton. But he does have some issues. The person he's going to face is a Republican named Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln had served in the House once before. He served one term and then he went back to practicing law. But he gets drawn back into politics by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He is very intensely moved by some of these actions, and he challenges Douglas to a debate. Actually, there's 7 debates. And they run from August 21st to October 15, 1858. And thousands of people would come out to watch these debates, to listen. And Douglas and Lincoln could be no closer together. Douglas was a very suave, debonair, put together man. He arrived for his debates on a train. Lincoln looked like a scarecrow in clothes. Rode his horse to the different debates. And they discussed a lot of the issues that are facing the country. Now, in the end, Douglas retains his seat, but Lincoln makes a name. And name recognition is very important. And people know where he stands on a lot of the issues. He comes off as very sincere, very in touch with the common man. But Douglas does win the election. And then John Brown comes back. Things were starting to kind of ease up. by 1859, the panic is fading, general prosperity is returning to the country. People are seeing maybe the clouds are breaking, maybe this isn't all going to go down. And then John Brown decides that he's going to raid Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry, Virginia is the location of the National Arsenal. That's not the way to say that. Arsenal? Yes. There are also the Springfield factories are there, gun factories. It's fairly close to Washington. And his plan is that he will raid the arsenal, raid the factory, get arms and ammunition, and disperse them to the nearby slaves, who will then rise up and take the South. He's basically going to start a big slave revolt. And he does have some former slaves in his group that go to raid. It doesn't go well. He actually does take Harper's Ferry. But then the townspeople rally back. He's basically besieged within the town. Then Buchanan sends in the military, the Marines. There has always been, since the Marines started, a Marine regiment based in Washington, D.C. And the Marines are the ones they send in to quell this. He loses 2 sons. He's really a harsh man. One of his sons is shot, and he's begging his father, shoot me and take me out of my misery. And he looks at him and he says, die like a man, and then goes on and leaves him there to die. Brown does not get killed in the raid. He gets captured. It's like one of those made-for-TV movies. They're in this little room, and the Marines bust open the door, and he's sitting there with his rifle ready to shoot the first Marine that walks through the door, and the first Marine that walks through the door clocks him in the head with a saber, with the hilt of his saber, and knocks him out. He's hung. He's convicted of treason. He's hung on October 30, or he's convicted on October 31st. He's hung on December 1st, and he immediately becomes a martyr. He's a martyr for the cause, and he gives this not eloquent, but he gives a speech. It is a little eloquent about, he only has one life to give for the cause, and he will give it willingly. But it just stirs everything back up. Southerners are now afraid. The fear of a slave revolt has always been there. And of course, John Brown thought all of these slaves would immediately rush to help him. Well, I think he got like 4. People ran away from a nearby plantation to go help him. They all probably got killed. But it was not the uprising that he thought. It's funny, we always assume other people will do something that they won't. It's like the British kept coming when they always thought that the Tories would rise up and help them, and they didn't. But the slaves didn't rise up. But it reignites this fear in the South of slave revolts. And now you have a new problem. Now it's not just going to be because the slaves managed to revolt. You're going to have some Yankee come in and bring them guns. So the tensions get real high. And we have another election. At this point, things are getting so bad that the Democrats divide. The Democrats have been the only party that has held together through all of this. You're going to get Lincoln running in the North. I didn't write down who all ran. You're going to have a Democrat You're gonna have Lincoln running as the Republican. A man named Bell is going to run in the South. I can't remember who Lincoln ran against in the North. It might have been Douglas. But it's such a messed up election that, like, Lincoln's name doesn't even appear on the ballots in the South. They won't even list the Republicans. But Lincoln will win. And the South sees that as a signal that the end is near. South Carolina will secede by December of 1860. So Lincoln's elected in 1860. He doesn't even take office until 61. But before he even takes office, South Carolina is going to secede. The following February, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas will all secede. The CSA, the Confederate States of America, is actually formed on February 3rd, made up of these states. And nobody does anything. Buchanan makes no efforts to keep the states from seceding. He makes no efforts at compromise. Lincoln stays oddly quiet through all of this. Now, he's the president-elect. He doesn't really have power. But he, too, does not make any efforts to bring the country back together. And the end's in sight. It's just a waiting game to see what's going to happen. And Lincoln never really made any statements that he was going to end slavery. In fact, the statements he made was that he didn't want to see slavery expand, but it was fine where it was, that it would die out of its own natural death. But the South wasn't buying that. And when he is elected, or when he does take office on March 4th, he promises to, quote, not interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists, but he vows that the union of the states is perpetual and that no state can lawfully get out of the union. He holds on to the federal courts in these different states that have seceded, delivers the mail, collects taxes. Basically, they're acting like they didn't secede. But by March 5th, things have the next day, he gets word from Major Robert Anderson, who is in control of the fort in the South Carolina, at Fort Sumner in South Carolina, that he only has 1 month's supply. And when Lincoln tries to resupply the fort, that's when it's fired upon and war starts. So, we're not going to get into the war. We're just getting up to it. It's kind of anticlimactic once Lincoln's elected because nobody did anything. It was really, you can't, it's one of those things that if you play the what if game, armchair quarterback, what if Buchanan had actually done something? What if Buchanan had actually said, hey, you can't secede, it's not legal. Things might have turned out differently. But we got through everything, so no class on Friday. Get your test. I will get it posted by Friday. I will try to get it posted before that. I may get it posted this afternoon if I get a chance. get it done by midnight on Monday. That is the one time I am actually going to hit a deadline. I will cut it off at that point, so, get it done, but you have days. You have plenty of time to get it done. Have a fabulous Christmas holiday, or whatever holiday you wish to celebrate during the winter months. And hopefully I'll see some of you in the spring. If not, good luck with your college careers.
So that's our final, is the one that's due by midnight by day.
Yes, there's 2 tests that are gonna be open that you have to take by Monday midnight. The one over the south and this one. Got it?
So this was the last class?
This is the last class.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed having you on the class.
Thank you.
You especially, because you come every time.
Have a good break.
You too.